Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about the sovereignty and security of Canada's Arctic. Canada is one of 8 Arctic nations that makes up the Arctic Council, and we claim sovereignty over the upper regions of North America, along with the related archipelago. Canada has more Arctic landmass than any other country, but one of the smallest Arctic populations. Our Arctic includes parts of the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, the Yukon, as well as some parts of Newfoundland and Labrador, and some parts of northern Quebec. However, there's some legal dispute over Canada's claims of sovereignty in the Arctic, and this dispute has created security issues for our country. Here today to talk about Canada's Arctic sovereignty and security are 3 experts. Tom Axworthy is the Public Policy Chair at Massey College. Professor Whitney Lackenbauer is the Canada Research Chair in the Study of the Canadian North and professor at Trent University. And Rob Hubert teaches advanced studies in Canadian Arctic security at the University of Calgary. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Robert, let's get back to basics. What are the main points of contention over Canada's claims to the Arctic?
The major one, and the one that gets the most attention, is, of course, over the status of the waterways of the Northwest Passage. Canada claims that they are internal waters, which means that Canada has complete control, the way they would have, say, over Lake Winnipeg or Great Slave Lake or any of the other lakes. In other words, Canadian laws are made by Canadian political leadership, and we can basically say and do what we want within that context. The international community, led by the Americans and followed by the British, Singaporeans, and the Germans, take the position that it's an international waterway, which means that as long as ships are following international rules, that they do not have to ask Canadian permission. And so that, in effect, is the major sovereignty issue. There's other side issues that can be considered sovereignty, but when people say sovereignty, it's about the Northwest Passage.
So, Tom, what are some of those side issues when we're talking about sovereignty?
Well, in addition to the Northwest Passage, which Robert said that's the centerpiece, but we, again, with the United States bilaterally, there are issues on the delineation of the Beaufort Sea, who owns what there, and there are some possibilities of hydrocarbon. Hans Island on the other side of the coast with Denmark and Greenland is right smack in the middle of the 2 legal sovereignties. So we've had discussions for years about whether Hans Island should become a condominium or like Solomon, divided in half. And then lastly, Canada has overlapping claims in the law of the sea, where there is recognition of economic zones. But if you can show that the mountains under the Arctic Ocean are part of your geography, you get additional nautical miles, some considerable, 200 to 300, to add to your store. And that is being evaluated by a scientific committee under the law of the sea. But Russia, Canada, and Denmark / Greenland have overlapping claims on the same territory. We say the mountain ridge comes from Ellesmere Island. The Danes say it comes from Greenland, and the Russians say it comes down from Siberia. So, in fact, there are 4 or 5 sovereignty issues around the Arctic, but Rob's right. It's the Northwest Passage that everyone focuses on.
So Whitney, how do these disagreements about either the waterways or the competing sovereignty claims, how do these get resolved? Is there a legal process? Is it through diplomacy? How do we solve these questions?
Well, it's a wonderful question, Christine. I think it cuts the core. There are almost 3 different baskets of questions. On the one hand, you've got the core sovereignty ones about territory and ownership. Hans Island, the Beaufort Sea that Tom referred to. These are going to be dealt with bilaterally between Canada, Kingdom of Denmark, and Greenland, Canada, and the United States. When you're looking at the extended continental shelf, so our rights not to all the waters in the Central Arctic Ocean, just to resources that may exist on the seabed or under the seabed beyond our 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, so far away from our coast, where there's those overlaps with Denmark, the United States, and the Russian Federation. Those are scripted through a process through the United Nations and a commission on the limits of the continental shelf. So we submit our scientific data as we've done, and eventually we'll sit down and negotiate that out. What I love to remind people is it's in the best interest of all of the Arctic states for us to all claim as much of that continental shelf as we can.
Whitney,
so that
we
can
have to go
separate
to
it out.
commercial break, but I'm going to let you finish when we come back from this message. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about Arctic sovereignty and security. Whitney, before the commercial break, we were talking about how these disputes over sovereignty, either the waterways or the actual other parts of this dispute, how they get resolved, whether it's legally or diplomatically. You went through two of the ways they get resolved. What was that third route to resolution?
Well, the third one is the tricky one. It's the Northwest Passage, and I'm sure some of my colleagues here will disagree with me on this. I don't think there is an easy resolution. One outcome could be the Americans taking us to an international court and us prevailing in our position or the Americans prevailing. The solution that we've come up with the United States was an agreement diplomatically arranged in 1988 to agree to disagree on the legal status of the waters, but to say from an operational standpoint, we can put aside that legal issue and just manage things as friends and as allies. And we've been very successful in doing that. The big question is, can that continue in perpetuity into the future?
Rob, why don't you respond to that? Do you think that that is the route to resolution, or is there a different route?
There's going to be a different way in terms of this resolution, because the Americans, despite the efforts to have these elements come in, the Americans have never changed their position. They've led it when it's been okay to go on these issues, but they've never changed their position that it's an international strait. There's a further difficulty that Canada faces, is that we have never really gotten serious about being able to say no to anyone. The Russians have sort of a similar claim to the waterways, and they say no to those that they don't want in. We had a New Zealand yacht that in the midst of the COVID crisis last year, basically sailed through. Yes, we're going to fine them. Yes, we said, naughty boat, don't go through, you're breaking our rules. But it illustrated the fact that we haven't necessarily taken the steps or had the political will to say no to shipping. And I think that that in the long term is really going to be problematic for Canada once the shipping, as you pointed out, because of climate change, really starts increasing.
So, Tom, I want to ask you about where China stands on all of this, because I know that China has recently declared itself a near Arctic state. What does that mean for their role in this dispute over the territory and their claims over these waterways?
Well, China had a white paper in 2018 saying that it was a near Arctic state and having a large enunciation of the amount that it would spend on research in the Arctic and the Antarctic, which is very considerable. And then a few alarm bells went off when they announced in that paper that the Arctic would also be considered to be part of the Belt and Road, that there would be a polar component of that Silk Road. And of course, geopolitically, there's many concerns about China gaining influence through the Belt and Road Initiative throughout Asia, Latin America, Africa. And now they've at least posited that the Arctic is part of it, and they've been very active in seeking out investments in Greenland. Now, in terms of the actual legality issue, China has no claim on the Arctic except as an international actor that can use international waters. So they have not explicitly come down on either side of the debate between Canada and the United States. They've been quite diplomatic there, but not so long ago, the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, President Trump's Secretary of State, used a speech where he raised great fears about Chinese activities in the Arctic, blasted Russia in the same speech, and then surprised people by also saying, and Russia is not the only one which has an illegitimate claim to its passage, so does Canada. So we were lumped in with the Chinese and the Russians. And so Rob's entirely right. The United States has never changed its opinion about the international strait issue. And in the Trump administration, toward the end, they said some pretty provocative things about the Arctic and about us, and even at one point raised the prospect of a freedom of navigation sailing through the Northwest Passage. That would have been a crisis of absolutely enormous proportions had they tried it. Now they didn't, but it was raised at Secretary of Defense levels. So we missed a very big crisis just by the waning months of the Trump administration.
Wow, I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that. I mean, there was a lot of news going on with Trump in general. It's kind of hard to keep up with everything he was saying that was a little out there. But I certainly missed that. So thanks for drawing it to our attention. We've got to go to commercial break, but when we get back from this break, we're going to talk more about this issue. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about Arctic sovereignty and security. Whitney, I want to turn to you. How does the very small size of Canada's Arctic population contribute to the ability of other regions to challenge our claims to that territory?
Well, it's a great question. And I think one of the things is we often speak in general strokes about the Arctic, talking about the circumpolar Arctic, so spanning all of the Arctic countries. I tend to think of the Arctic as a series of subregions. And looking at the different human populations, but also physical geography considerations. In the Canadian Arctic, it's a relatively depauperate environment, meaning there's not a lot of resources to sustain large human populations. There never has been. So we have about 118,000, 120,000 residents in our 3 northern territories, which, given the size of those territories, 40% of Canada's landmass, is a very tiny ratio. So by definition, I see this as both a strength and potentially a vulnerability. The strength is there's not a lot of natural military targets that foreign adversaries would look to want to go and attack within our Arctic. The flip side is when we're wanting to have a robust presence to communicate that we're serious about the Arctic, we can't turn to mass numbers of people. Instead, what Canada's done very effectively is built very strong relationships with our northern populations, including a very large percentage of Indigenous peoples in our Arctic compared to other Arctic regions, and really work to share sovereignty and come up with really innovative ways of governing, which makes it a really strong position for Canada to be able to project itself into the world stage.
So, Rob, I want to talk about that robustness of the population and the role of the military in the Arctic. What can you tell us about the strength of a military presence in the Arctic and how that relates to sovereignty claims, including Canada's military presence and foreign military presence?
Oh, you've hit the head of the big issue. And this is the thing that Canadians have so much troubles with. There is the military that you can use for Arctic sovereignty for symbolic purposes. And in actual fact, from an international legal perspective, it's relatively limited. But really what you're talking about, even though you've said Arctic sovereignty, and this is what so many of us do, you're talking Arctic security. And this is the problem, because if you're talking about just presence, the military doesn't really do that much for reinforcing. They could possibly for arresting ships going through, such as the Kiwi Row or the any other ships we don't want going through. The issue that's happening now, and this is the critical one that we really have to be aware of, there is a new Arctic security threat. The Russians have been militarizing, and we see new weapon systems being introduced that have to be delivered from the Arctic. And that is really what we need our military to be able to respond to, because it's new hypersonic weapons, it's new underwater vehicles, it's a new security regime. So it's not about having, our military being, as human flag posts throughout the Canadian North. It's about being able to detect the increased Russian militarization and being able to respond. And that puts a totally different kettle of fish rather than just simply a presence. This is actually responding in at the heart of what a military has to do. Since the threat's coming from Russia, since the weapon systems are primarily Arctic-based, that's why Arctic security has become so important to so many governments in the current period.
So, Tom, Britain recently offered Canada military help to defend the Arctic. What was that offer all about, and where does it stand now?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Perhaps Rob or someone else would know the details of it. We've in the past acquired submarines from Britain, which didn't work out very well. But Rob, do you know the specifics of the British offer?
Yeah, the specifics of what we're doing is that the British, first of all, gave hints that they want to help us with underwater protection, the submarine. It was a very broad hint, not specific. We now have an agreement between us and the Canadian Coast Guard is going to be training British naval officers on how to operate in ice conditions. And they are increasingly looking to responding to this Russian submarine threat. And that's why they want to get that training for their personality. The irony here, of course, and I just want to make this clear, behind the Americans disagreeing with us on the Northwest Passage, the British were the next to say that the Northwest Passage is not internal waters, but an international strait. So once again, this sovereignty security issue that we tend to lump all together really gives a complexity that we have to be really sensitive to.
Thanks so
And
much.
Christine, sorry, Christine, if I may.
Yeah, just in 10 seconds.
Yeah, it's important to also differentiate between what the British offer and what other media sources have been suggesting this represents. They're two very different things.
When we come back from this break, we'll get into that. And I also want to talk about the role of climate change in this issue. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about Arctic sovereignty and security. Whitney, I wanted to give you a chance to follow up on the last segment where we were talking about the British offer to provide military assistance to Canada in the Arctic.
Thanks. Well, British General Sir Nick Carter reached out a couple of months ago and then again in the last few weeks, offering British help to cooperate in terms of Arctic security with Canada. The way this has been ingested, and in my mind, misrepresented by some commentators and by some media outlets, is suggesting that this shows that Canada is completely deficient and Britain's trying to meddle in our affairs. This gets wrapped up into our chronic insecurity over sovereignty, as we've been talking about. At the same time, it's being used in a common refrain by some commentators to suggest that this proves we're incapable of defending ourselves. I think it overlooks the fact that we're longstanding allies with Britain. We work within a construct of NATO, and we've always welcomed opportunities to partner with allies like Britain. We've often trained, even in the Canadian Arctic context, with British forces. It's written in our defense policy that we are going to do so. I think a lot of this has been really misrepresented, and people are trying to make hay about something that's really not that rich a harvest of trying to embarrass the Trudeau government.
Well, I appreciate you providing the clarification. Tom, I want to turn now to how climate change is affecting Arctic policy and claims of Arctic sovereignty, especially as it relates to the archipelago and as ice recedes.
Well, that's the essential fact, and it's been mentioned in the Chinese white paper and everywhere that as the ice recedes and melts, the shipping lanes will become perhaps more useful and more important. And therefore, issues about what rules will govern the use of those shipping lanes, environmental protection and so on, become even more important if they are widely used. So there is a direct logical connection between climate change, open water, and sovereignty on the rules of who will use that open water.
And Rob, your views on climate change as well and its role in this debate, and in particular as it opens up other potential resources in the North.
Yeah, the critical point of climate change, of course, is it's an existential threat. It requires us to cooperate with those from a military perspective are a direct threat. This is the paradox of climate change in the Arctic. We've got to work with the Chinese and the Russians on that point, and yet it's the Chinese and the Russians that are posing the military threat. Climate change itself doesn't change the nature of the militarization, except in terms of surface vessels. And this gets back to the cooperation with the British. We have been exercising more with the British in terms of anti-submarine capabilities because the water is opening up. And we're going to see increased naval activity, surface naval activity, in terms of what's happening in the Arctic. And that's going to be the critical climate change impact on the strategic level that going into the future. But the bigger issue, how do we solve it when we need to cooperate with countries that are trying to undermine our very existence. And that's going to be the problem going into the future.
Whitney, your views on climate change and its impact on claims of sovereignty, as I mentioned, especially as it relates to resources as well.
Great, thanks. Well, I always like to bundle these threats and say there's a difference between threats that will pass through the Arctic, threats to the Arctic, so from outside the region that are actually targeting the Arctic, and threats within the Arctic. And I say the ones passing through the Arctic are largely dealing with technology. I don't think climate change is the decisive factor or driver in all of this. Threats to the Arctic, absolutely. Increasing openness, access to resources, to waters, does invite potential actors to come in and requires us to be prepared. And as both Rob and Tom have said, to make sure we have the tools to exercise control. I think the big question, though, is what this environmental change means for people living in the Arctic, our northern peoples, how we can ensure that they have the tools to support resilient, healthy communities, to determine the futures that they want to chart for themselves, and to not allow some of this security talk to get in the way of them being very much at the forefront of determining what priorities should be and what different option sets look like for Canadians to pursue.
Well, it's certainly a really fascinating topic and something that I think a lot of Canadians might not be very knowledgeable about. Hopefully after today's show, they're a little bit more informed. I want to thank all three of you for coming on and sharing your insight and expertise today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christine.
We've heard today about the complex international, legal, and diplomatic issues surrounding Canada's Arctic sovereignty and security, and the challenges our country is facing by competing powers failing to recognize our claims. How will Canada assert our claim to our territory, especially as climate change causes physical shifts to that territory? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.